Good evening, everyone. This is Melissa. I work with the National Ocean Sciences Bowl. I'm with the national office in Washington, D.C. And I'd like to welcome you tonight to our third presentation in our 2013 Professional Development webinar series. Um, just, I'm thinking most of you are probably coaches for NOSB teams, but in case you're not, the National Ocean Sciences Bowl is an academic competition for high school students, and they get tested in their knowledge of all things related to ocean and marine science, from chemistry, biology, marine policy, which is the topic for this evening, and they also get tested in their knowledge of some freshwater science. This year there'll be a slight greater infusion of questions on freshwater science, since our theme for the year is the Great Lakes, a window into freshwater science, and we will be holding finals in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. As I said, this is our third presentation in this webinar series. If you did not get to watch the first two webinars, we do have the recordings available online at our webinar site. Feel free to go watch them and to use them to practice for your regional competitions. With all of our webinars, we have a pretty simple agenda. We're going to have our speaker tonight present for about an hour on the topic, and then we're going to have a 30-minute question and answer session. So on your Adobe Connect screen that you're all looking at, you'll see that there is a Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner. That is where you can type in a question at any point during the evening that you have for the presenter. We'll let him go through his entire presentation, and at the end, I will read the questions that you've typed in aloud to our presenter, and he will provide the responses back to you. I just want to remind you that you are all on mute. Even though you have the opportunity to have a webcam or a microphone this evening, we're going to keep you all on mute simply so that there isn't any background noise while our presenter is speaking, and also so that it's a little easier for everyone to hear when it does come time for the question and answer session. Again, please use the Q&A box to submit any questions. If you would also like to provide any feedback for the presenter or the national office on the presentation, you can also type that into the Q&A box. Also, on our website for the webinar series, if you just go to our homepage, you'll see a link for it. We also have a comment box on each presenter's page. You can also type questions in there if you happen to think of one, say tomorrow, after the presentation is over with, and we'll try to get the answer posted for you as quickly as possible. So tonight, I'm happy to introduce Peter McAvoy. He is with the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. As with our previous presenters, he's also with the School of Freshwater Sciences. And he is going to be presenting tonight on water policy issues with the Great Lakes, specifically the Great Lakes Compact, which he has had a big role in. So I'm going to turn over the presentation to him in just a minute, but I'd also like to remind you that Thursday evening we have our fourth webinar, and it's going to be Drs. Diaz and Kuhl again. They presented last week on the Lake Michigan food web and invasive species. This Thursday evening they will be presenting their second webinar, taking the information that they provided in the last webinar and putting it into practice by discussing quagga mussels and how they relate to the Lake Michigan food web. So I hope that you will all participate on Thursday night as well. So right now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Peter so that he can present on his topic for the evening. And again, at any point in time when you have questions, please just type them into the Q&A box. Okay, Peter, the presentation is all yours.
All right. Thank you, Melissa, and good evening, everyone. I'm looking forward to this discussion with you. And the topic, as Melissa indicated, is the Great Lakes Compact. And I want to talk about why that's important, why it is important, and what it does, how it actually will operate as it's being implemented. But before I get into some of the specifics of the Great Lakes Compact, I wanted to give some background to why it was developed and what it was responding to, and to put it into some context about the Great Lakes themselves. This slide is showing obviously a picture of the Great Lakes from a satellite, and they're one of the greatest natural resources in the world. They're world-class resources, and there's nothing really that rivals them in terms of fresh water in the world. The lakes themselves are very large. They cover 95,000 square miles, and they represent 18% of the world's surface fresh water and 90% of the U.S. surface fresh water. So they are wonderful resources, and the size and the scale of them are really quite substantial. This particular slide, I want to, as far as showing you and giving you some dimension of how big they actually are. If you look at, and this is the east coast of the United States and part of Canada, the eastern seaboard, this is the Chesapeake Bay in comparison to the Great Lakes, Long Island, Cape Cod, etc. So it gives you some perspective on actually how large they are. When we talk about these statistics in terms of surface fresh water in the world, probably most of you know that 3/4 of the Earth's surface is covered by water, but 97% of that is salt water. And so the remaining portion of what is fresh water, a good portion of that is tied up in our poles or glaciers. And so these Great Lakes are, when you think about being accessible and available, it really drives home how important they are, not only to the populations and the peoples of the Great Lakes region, but to North America and what they mean to North America. The shoreline, when you add it up from all 5 Great Lakes, is over 10,000 miles long. And I should have said at the beginning, for those of you to get oriented, this is Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario. And so the water, Lake Superior is the largest, and it flows through, and it's the headwaters, and it drains through into Michigan and Huron, down through Erie, into Ontario, and then out through the St. Lawrence Seaway. And so when I'll be talking about the Great Lakes Basin and the compact, etc., but it's important to have that frame of reference. Some of the other additional background to this is that 40 million people get their drinking water from the Great Lakes, and that number is actually increasing. And the darker outline surrounding the lakes themselves actually is what we refer to as the Great Lakes Basin. And that's the drainage area that drains into the Great Lakes. And when you consider the size of the surface bodies of water, the basin, the outer area for rivers and streams that flow into the Great Lakes, it's actually not that large when you think about the volume of water that's contained in the lakes themselves. So while there's this smaller drainage basin, and part of the function of why, even though there's a large amount of water in the Great Lakes, that's really left over in large part from when the last Great Lakes, or the last glacier in North America, was receding, and it filled up the areas that it had gouged out that are now the Great Lakes. So it's important to understand that phenomena and the resource of the Great Lakes, because for all of their size, they are finite and they're very vulnerable. There are some very significant threats to the Great Lakes that have been around with us for some time, and they also have given rise to the impetus for why we went ahead and ultimately developed this Great Lakes Compact. Over the years, we have provided a number of insults, if you will, to the Great Lakes through pollution, through direct sources and non-point runoff, runoff from our agricultural fields, from industry, from business, through air pollution, air emissions. And while we've made significant progress over the last several decades, particularly as a result of the Clean Water Act that was passed in the early 1970s, there was great improvement overall in the water quality of the Great Lakes. But more recently, we've seen new emerging pollutants, and we've actually started to slip back on the progress that we had made through the 70s, 1980s, and 1990s. So pollution is very much a significant factor. And when you think about the lakes themselves and how big they are, there also is not they're not renewed in any significant way through rainfall, snow melt, or through the groundwater. There's only 1% of the lakes that are actually recharged or renewed each year. And so the retention time for the larger lakes like Lake Michigan, which is almost 100 years, meaning what we put in to Lake Michigan is going to stay there for all intents and purposes for over a century. And for Lake Superior, it's even larger. It's about 190 years for the retention times. We also have experienced more recently significant drops in the levels of the Great Lakes. But there's a cycle to this where the lakes themselves actually rise and fall and have done that for thousands of years. But what we are experiencing more recently is significant drops in the lakes. And I think now they may be at their all-time low, at least in recorded history. We're also seeing this more and more, the effects of invasive species. In fact, my colleagues here at the School of Freshwater Sciences, Russell and Carmen, will be presenting on some of these impacts, and Melissa had mentioned the quagga mussels. These invasive species, for the most part, have come in through ships that have come in off the oceans through the St. Lawrence Seaway, and they've brought in many of the species that we have here that are not native to the Great Lakes, and they are creating huge problems for the ecosystem. And the threat of even more coming in has a number of people concerned. The most recent is the possibility of Asian carp getting into the Great Lakes. For those of you who are familiar with these critters, they're really voracious eaters, and they would really cause havoc if they do get into the Great Lakes and are able to be sustained given their eating habits and what they would do to the habitat and to the other living species in the lakes. Another major factor that has many people concerned here in our region, and not just in our region but worldwide, is the fact that I think all of us know that the populations of the world are growing and growing significantly, and that fresh water, safe drinking potable water, is really becoming an issue around the world. In fact, over 1/6 of the world's population, over 1 billion people, do not have access to clean water, clean potable drinking water. And those statistics are only getting worse and are likely to continue to get worse as the population grows, and the way that we've been using water, the per capita consumption of water is going up along with the populations growing, particularly in the developing world. And that combination is likely to create more chaos and more crises as we go into the 21st century. There's also this unbelievable wild card now with climate change, and we're already seeing evidence of climate change on the Great Lakes. Temperatures are rising, and rising very quickly, and the likelihood is that that will continue. And some of the modeling of the long-term modeling for impacts of climate change would indicate that the lake levels are going to be affected even more. They're going to drop more. And while the oceans will be rising, the Great Lakes, many believe, will continue to be lowered in this with the impacts of climate change. So those combination of factors, pollution, lake levels dropping, invasive species, population growth, and climate change, do not bode well for even a world-class resource like the Great Lakes. And what has been clear to a number of us who've worked in the field in water resources and water resources management and water law for many years is that the Great Lakes government structure has not been very good at solving some of the legal issues around how we can better manage the Great Lakes going forward to ensure that they will be there for generations to come. What complicates this is that we have two federal governments, Canadian federal government, the US federal government. We have 8 states, 2 Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec. And then we have literally thousands of local units of government and special districts throughout the region. So trying to pull the governments together to have some unified management strategy that would be effective and enforceable has been a real problem over the years in terms of the Great Lakes. In earlier decades, going back even before the 1980s, there were efforts made to try and develop a strategy that the Great Lakes states and the provinces could agree on. And one of the notable ones was that came about was when the governors of the 8 states and the premiers from Ontario and Quebec got together in the early 80s and began developing what eventually turned out as the Great Lakes Charter. And the Great Lakes Charter really was the first time that the states and the provinces came together and agreed upon some management structure to try and protect the Great Lakes. But one of the significant problems with the Charter is that it was not enforceable. It was a good faith agreement, and the states and the provinces were expected to pass individual legislation to implement the Charter. Most of the states did not. Wisconsin, where I'm presenting from, was one of the few. So we continue to have these gaps in enforcement. In the year after the Charter was adopted, there was a major piece of legislation moving through the US Congress, Water Resources Development Act of that year, 1986. And one of the senators from Wisconsin introduced an amendment, and it was only about 2 sentences into this massive document. Most people didn't even know it was there. And what that amendment did was it required that if there was going to be any diversions out of the Great Lakes, all 8 Great Lakes states would have to agree to that diversion. Now, on the face of it, that seemed pretty strong. It seemed to have a lot of teeth in it. But the fact of the matter is that legislation did not provide for any standards or any way that you could reasonably point to why a particular state or all of the states came to a decision that they did. And therefore, it was believed that this amendment to this Water Resources Development Act would likely be challenged and would be struck down. So we still continue to have this gap in not having an effective and enforceable management strategy. And as we got further into the 1990s, there was a group that came together, and this was a rather innovative idea. It was called the NOVA Group, and they actually operated out of the province of Ontario. And they were bringing in tankers and filling these tankers up, ocean-going tankers, with water from the Great Lakes, and then shipping the water over to Asia. And it says something about water scarcity and how important fresh water is obviously to all of us as living beings, that you could actually make a profit out of bringing these ships in, filling them up with water, and then transporting them thousands of miles to the other side of the world and make a profit off of that and selling the water. So while we've had, and I didn't mention some of the more significant diversion proposals that we had in the past that were not successful, we had this NOVA group that came forward, and they proposed shipping, and were in fact shipping water out of the Great Lakes. And it was then that the governors and premiers realized that these gaps in our ability to manage and control the Great Lakes were really very paramount, and we really needed to do something about that. And if we didn't do something about it, the Great Lakes states and the provinces were going to lose control of the Great Lakes water resources. The privatization, if you will, of this world-class resource was likely to happen, and the ability to ensure that the Great Lakes would be not only here now, but for future generations that would contribute to our economic growth and our well-being, that too could be lost, and lost fairly quickly. So I wanted to show this slide to all of you to give you then some perspective on the Great Lakes states. And for those of you who live in the region, you're probably pretty familiar with this, but the percentages that you're looking at are actually how much of each state is within the Great Lakes Basin. So if you look at Minnesota at 7%, this portion of Minnesota is on the Lake Superior shoreline and is within the Great Lakes Basin. Wisconsin is 32%, but it varies considerably. Illinois only has 0.2% of its state within the Great Lakes Basin. That's around Chicago. And then you have Michigan, on the other hand, which is almost entirely, 99.9% of Michigan is entirely within the Great Lakes Basin. New York is fairly sizable, 32%. And that has had a big impact on how the states have looked at the Great Lakes and what programs, policies, laws that they have that affect the Great Lakes. So the more contact, the more involvement of a state with the Great Lakes, it's more likely we've seen some substantial rules, regulations, and laws that have been adopted by those states. But it's not an even process. It's not very uniform in how we've looked at the Great Lakes states. And then while I've talked about the Canadian provinces, sometimes, and rightly so, those of us who live on this side of the border, the United States, oftentimes we talk about the Great Lakes as if there wasn't a Canada and there weren't Canadian provinces, but in fact, they have a lot of say and they have a lot of control, and they actually have a good portion of Lake Superior, which is in Ontario. Huron, Erie, and Ontario all are within the province of Ontario, and the St. Lawrence Seaway, the St. Lawrence River, also flows through Quebec. The only lake, Great Lake, does not share a border with Canada is Lake Michigan, but Lake Michigan is tied to Lake Huron. And so anything that we do in Lake Michigan arguably will also affect not only Lake Huron, but the lower lakes, Erie and Ontario. So Canada for a long time has made these points about if we're doing anything on the Great Lakes, we really very much need them at the table to be active partners and collaborators on whatever we're proposing for the Great Lakes. But it makes for an interesting process to not only get the 8 states to agree on something, but to get the Canadian provinces to be part of that. And What happened several years ago after these gaps were identified in the law and in policy, and the fact that we could very well lose the Great Lakes, is that we came to the conclusion that if we were going to do something, we would have to do it on a two-track approach. And so what happened was we began developing two different agreements. And one of the agreements, this is a lengthy title, but and we can get you the citations to it, but it's called the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Basin Sustainable Water Resources Agreement. And that agreement actually is between the 8 states and the 2 Canadian provinces. And we developed on a separate track what eventually became the Great Lakes Compact. And the Compact is between the 8 states, the 8 Great Lakes states of the United States. And that is the enforceable provisions of the international agreement between the Canadian provinces and the state. And you may wonder, well, why did we have to do this? Why didn't we just have one agreement, which would have been simpler? Well, there's a set of provisions in our Constitution and under the laws of the United States which prevents individual states or groups of states in the United States of entering into formal enforceable agreements with a foreign power. So we couldn't do that. So the way that we approached this dilemma, this fork in the road, if you will, this two-track approach, was to get the agreement between the provinces and the states, but it wasn't going to be enforceable unless we developed an individual compact between the states to enforce it. And then the Canadian provinces adopted their own rules and laws to implement the provisions of the international agreement. And that's where we are today. And the compact, which is between the 8 states and was adopted by the 8 states, is actually broken into 3 distinctive parts which deal with in-basin uses, if you think back to when I was laying out the Great Lakes Basin. So waters that are within the Great Lakes Basin are affected by this first category or this first section of the Great Lakes Compact. And that's where the states and the provinces have agreed on a common decision-making standard that would be employed by all of the parties, all of the jurisdictions, to regulate the uses of the water within the Great Lakes Basin. And significantly, on any major new or increased consumptive uses, that is a consumptive use is where water is actually lost from the Great Lakes. It's not returned. It can be through evaporation, but more commonly, the way that we would lose it is to include it into a product like corn or soybean, where we use water from the Great Lakes to irrigate our crops. The crops are grown, and we then ship them out of the basin, in some cases out of our states. And so that water is never returned to the Great Lakes, and it's considered a consumptive use or water loss. Another way, commonly, is to, and we're seeing more and more of this, where we bottle water and then send the bottled water out of the region, and therefore that's lost as well. And for those of us in Milwaukee, we make beer, and if it's shipped out of the region or out of the basin, it's consumed somewhere else, that water is also lost in that beer. So there are different decision-making standards that affect these in-basin uses, and all of the states and provinces have agreed on what those are and at what trigger points they would get the opportunity to comment, review and comment on any new or proposed large consumptive use. The second major category in the Great Lakes Compact, and I think it's one of the most significant sections of the Great Lakes Compact. It doesn't get a lot of attention. We hope, those of us who worked on this, we hope that in the years ahead that we continue to make progress on this. But what we all agreed to in this region was that we would develop specific goals and programs for the conservation and efficient use of the Great Lakes. We have never had that before. I mean, those of us who live in this region, we know that we have this wonderful resource. We have abundant water resources, but even in states like Wisconsin, we're now experiencing scarcity of water resources. And the drafters of the compact and the international agreement recognize that we have to put in place water conservation measures that really mean something, that are really having an impact, and that we will also put in place and are committed to actually developing information and data. This is where the science comes into this, of what we're doing with the water, what impacts we're having, and to actually do it in a uniform way. Here we are in 2013, and there is no uniform reporting system on water use within the 8 states and within the Canadian provinces. And you really can't manage something very effectively if you don't know what's going on with it. And in the case of water resources and in a complex and complicated system like the Great Lakes, we really need to get a handle on that. So the states and the provinces have agreed on a uniform reporting system, and that reporting system will be reviewed every 5 years on what is actually happening to the Great Lakes, what's happening to the water quantity, water quality, but importantly, how we're using the water and how we're conserving it and what difference it's making as we go forward. The third section of the Great Lakes Compact is actually what gets a lot of attention, and it has resulted in setting up a set of requirements that would affect diversions. And a diversion is where you move water out of the Great Lakes, out of the Great Lakes basin, and transfer to another watershed, to another basin. And one of the largest diversions in the history of the United States, not just in the Great Lakes, involves Chicago. And early in the 1900s, Chicago was having enormous problems with its drinking water, which it was getting from Lake Michigan, because it was polluting Lake Michigan from all of its stockyards and the large growing city. So what it came up with, its solution, was that it reversed the Chicago River, which used to flow into Lake Michigan, and it channeled the river so that it could be discharged into the Illinois River and ultimately into the Mississippi River and to the Gulf of Mexico. And Chicago, with this diversion, was diverting an enormous amount of water. The other Great Lakes states did not like that, and they actually went to court. And over many years, it eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court entered into the fray and resolved it by saying that Chicago could continue to divert water from Lake Michigan, but at a greatly reduced rate. It's still a huge amount of water. 2 billion gallons a day are diverted out of Lake Michigan and eventually wind up going into the Mississippi River and to the Gulf of Mexico. And it's still a sore spot with many of the Great Lakes states. And the U.S. Supreme Court, even after all these years, maintains jurisdiction over that diversion settlement. And so Chicago and Illinois cannot change the standards of the diversion or the agreement without the approval of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, in a different way, we've had other diversions into the Great Lakes. Now, these are pretty unusual, but two of the largest, or the two largest, are actually on Ontario's side of Lake Superior. One is Long Lac and the other is Ogaki, where the Canadians built dams and diverted water that normally would be flowing north, and they diverted it south into Lake Superior. These two diversions are also quite sizable, and one of the reasons why they did it was to develop hydroelectric power to fuel new economic development in Ontario. that took place for the most part up to and during World War II. Now the compact puts in some language which is pretty straightforward and says that all new or increased diversions will be prohibited. And folks thought, well, that's pretty straightforward, but they went ahead in the drafters, and this was a compromise, to allow for 3 exceptions, limited exceptions to the outright ban on any new or expanded diversions. And these 3 exceptions, and if you bear with me, I'll explain what they are. The first would involve communities that actually lie partially within the Great Lakes Basin and partially outside the basin. So you may have a city, we have several communities in Wisconsin, but there are several in Indiana and Ohio and New York that also would be eligible if they could meet the requirements of being a straddling community. And the community then would have to meet certain requirements in order to demonstrate that it was eligible for this exception under the compact. Now, another category of exceptions would involve communities in straddling counties. Now, these communities would lie entirely outside the Great Lakes Basin, but they were in a county that straddled the basin. So I hope I'm not losing you there, but maybe we'll have some questions about this. But there are numbers of communities, obviously, that might qualify for an exception under these circumstances. And finally, the third category is intra-basin transfers. And maybe the way to explain that is because there are examples of this within the Great Lakes Basin, where you shift water, transfer water from one lake, and I'll use Ontario as an example, where communities in Ontario may pull water out of Lake Huron, and when they use it, they discharge it, and it actually goes, they discharge it into Lake Erie. So that's an intra-basin transfer of water, and that has a set of provisions and requirements that it would have to meet. Any community which would be seeking intra-basin transfer would have to meet those requirements. Now I want to talk a little bit about some of the basic requirements for qualifying for diversion, because this is really quite controversial and it's likely to be tested fairly soon. And I'll get into the specific test that we may be seeing coming out of my home state here in Wisconsin. But some of the key requirements for a community to qualify for one of these exceptions for a diversion are you have to demonstrate the need for the diversion, that it cannot be reasonably avoided through conservation practices, that there's no water supply alternative available to that community short of going and getting a diversion from one of the Great Lakes. Another requirement involves the amount of water that would be diverted. That is, what the request would be and on what basis and how much water would actually be considered reasonable for the diversion. So there's a set of requirements associated with determining the amount of water that could reasonably be diverted. And there's an interesting provision in the compact which requires any community that is diverting water under the new compact could use it, but then they would have to treat it and they would have to return it to the Great Lake that they received the water from. And this is going to prove to be pretty interesting in how this particular set of provisions around return flow is actually implemented if in fact we get that far and there's a request for a diversion. Some of the other important provisions, along with qualifying for, in order to qualify for a diversion, would be to determine if there's any adverse impacts and whether those adverse impacts to the Great Lakes or to the natural resources that are part of the Great Lakes Basin, whether they are significant or not. And the compact requires that no diversion will be allowed if there will be significant impacts to the quantity or quality of the waters of the Great Lakes Basin. And then the two provisions which we're a long way from testing yet, but if there is a diversion requested, and if the diversion is coming from one of the states, it would come through the state, it would be advanced for a regional review. And what that means is that all of the 8 Great Lakes states and the 2 Canadian provinces have an opportunity to review what's being proposed to determine whether or not they agree with it, whether they think it's been done properly, whether there needs to be additional conditions put on it. And in the case of the a straddling community, remember that was the second exception, a community within a straddling county, they have to meet an additional requirement. They have to get the approval of all 8 Great Lakes states. If any one of the states objects, then the application is denied. So there's going to be a rigorous review. It will involve first the state where the community that is requesting the diversion will have to review it and hold public hearings, and then it will have to decide whether or not it will advance it to the other Canadian provinces and the other 7 Great Lakes states for their comments. And then in the case of a community within a straddling county, it would have to get the approval of the other 7 states, not just a review and comment. So these requirements are significant. They were on purpose designed to be very significant and rigorous. And we'll see if, in fact, if we get to a situation where it's going to be tested. I'm going to stop here in a few minutes, but I want to come back to the compact itself. The Great Lakes Compact is one of the most significant interstate compacts in the history of the United States of America. It was took years to negotiate the agreement, but all 8 Great Lakes states had to adopt the compact language in total. Each of the state legislatures and their governors had to approve the exact same language. So the compact was adopted in Albany, in Madison, in Springfield, in Columbus. Every state adopted the same language. Then it was forwarded to the U.S. Congress, where it had to be ratified by the Congress, which it was, and then it had to be signed into law by the President, which it was. And all of that happened 5 years ago, in 2008. And we're at a point now where we may find the first significant test of the Great Lakes Compact, and it may be coming from my home state, Wisconsin, where there's a community, the city of Waukesha, which is working on an application. Waukesha is a community within a straddling county, so it's going to have to meet all the requirements I was talking about, and it's working on that application. It's an extensive endeavor on their part, and we haven't even begun the formal process of review and comment within our own state, let alone whether or not it will be advanced to the other states. But I wanted to cite that to you because for those of you who might be interested in this, you'll have a chance, because it doesn't mean that you have to be a resident of the state of Wisconsin to review and comment on this application if it gets that far, and certainly if it's advanced to the other states. It's fair game for any of the public to get involved and to comment. And given the significance of the Great Lakes, given how important they are as a world-class resource and how fragile they are and the challenges that they are meeting, we're hoping the groups that I've worked with over the years here in Wisconsin and throughout the Great Lakes region, we hope that if such an application is advanced, that it does get the proper attention and the comment and review. Now I'm going to stop here and see if we've got any questions about this material. I've hit you with a lot of information, and I I hope it's understandable, but I'm sure there'll probably be some questions related to what I was presenting. So I'll stop here.
Okay, it actually looks like we do have a few questions, and I think I'll start with the most recent. I can get it to open. Um, they're asking, does, I think you pronounced it, Waukesha, Wisconsin
Yes.
count as a straddling community in terms of diversion for drinking water?
Yes. That's a very good question. The One of the qualifiers, which I didn't mention, this is really only communities that are seeking water for a municipal water supply, a public water supply, can even apply. So yes, the city of Waukesha, which lies within the county of Waukesha, is a community within a straddling county. So they've had historically, more recently anyway, a problem with radium in their drinking water. And so one of the arguments that they're advancing is that they need to have an alternative water supply, and I think most people would agree that there's a major public health risk of if you're drinking water that has radium in it. The questions I think that are going to be raised with Waukesha, of course, are whether or not it can meet the other requirements. Does it have alternative water supplies available to it that don't have radium, or can they treat the water that they do have and remove the radium? So there's going to be a whole set of issues, but it is the city of Waukesha, which is a community within a straddling county in Wisconsin. I hope that answers the question.
We had a question that says, what about communities that are located outside of the Great Lake Basin who have historically gotten their water from the Great Lakes?
Another good question. Yeah, when the Great Lakes Compact was adopted, all of the existing users were grandfathered in. That means that if you were getting water from any of the Great Lakes, and it was actually a diversion at the time, that will still be protected, and those communities that came before the compact was adopted will continue to be able to use the water that they're getting from whatever the Great Lake they're drawing it out of.
Okay, another question. How did the Great Lakes Compact ever pass our Congress when water is the oil of the 21st century? It would seem like other locations would want access to water and look to the federal level to get it.
Absolutely correct. It was it took a lot of effort to get it through Congress. I think the advantage that in 2008 that we had was the unanimity of the Great Lakes states and their leaders all coming together. And as we all know, the partisan divisions that we see playing out in Washington, D.C. Now, what was unique about this was that it was bipartisan. It was supported by all of the governors and the legislators, and we made a very strong showing in that respect. But, you know, within that question or in that comment, there is an issue, and that's why I think it's important for us to do this right and to effectively implement the Great Lakes Compact. Because if we don't, other regions of the United States and other regions of North America or in other parts of the world, but certainly in North America, we're all aware of the problems of water and water resources and scarcity in the southwest of the United States or even in some of our southern states. So if we don't do a good job, if we don't manage this resource that is so important to our region, then Congress could actually change the Interstate Compact. We could do away with it. In effect, it could be eliminated, and that would be really unfortunate. So the burden is on us not only to have gotten it through Congress, but now to see it through and to implement it effectively as we go forward.
One person is asking, can you clarify what you mean when you say the Great Lakes Compact allowed for the states to use a uniform language?
Oh, okay. Um, Within the compact itself, there are two things. There's a set of standards that they adopted, very specific standards, and quite lengthy actually, that all of the states and the provinces will agree to use and to develop programs in implementing those standards. But the one part of the uniformity is, for example, we collect information here in Wisconsin about certain water uses throughout the state, not just in the Great Lakes. But our data collection and the data that we actually gather isn't necessarily the same data, the same information, or on the same water uses that Michigan might use. So what we are attempting to do under the compact is to agree on what are the uses that we want to better get information on, better data, and to do it in a way that's uniform across all of the states so that we're all collecting the same information about the same uses in our respective states. And then the idea is that we will combine that information and aggregate it in a way that will be useful for management so that we can better manage the Great Lakes and going forward. We have a better understanding of what's going on, what impacts it's having, and whether or not we need to change, modify some of our uses of the Great Lakes.
How does the Boundary Waters Treaty relate to the Great Lakes Compact?
Oh, that's a great question. The international treaty between Canada and the United States was adopted in 1909, and it does control a lot of decisions about the Great Lakes, but it actually involves, of course, the boundary between Canada and the United States from our west coast to our east coast. So it involves more than the Great Lakes, but it does have a big say in what goes on in the Great Lakes and what is in the treaty as far as the provisions between our two respective federal governments, but then the states and provinces. So there are regulations and restrictions around what we can do in the Great Lakes that are covered under the international treaty. But the international treaty has major gaps in itself. And that was one of the reasons why the states and the provinces went ahead on their own to try and develop an additional system of standards and protocols and regulations for what can go on in the Great Lakes and how we will affect these water uses, whether they're in basin or diversions or out of basin uses, so that we're clear about that. Because the treaty itself and the agreements that we have with Canada through our federal governments have major holes as well.
Okay, this is a long question, so I'll try to get through it. If the U.S. Congress did retract and reverse support for the compact in the future, how do you think that would affect the Canadian management of the lakes? Do you think Canada would have any recourse to prevent diversions into the interior, southern, or western parts of the United States?
That's a really interesting question. I have, now this is my personal view. I think that they would. Where it gets complicated, because they'd have to show or demonstrate the impact on any one of the lakes that and how it affects them, the Canadian provinces and the people who live in Canada. But let's say that they can do that, they can demonstrate that. Then what would normally happen is it would have to come through the equivalent of their State Department, through their Ministry of External Affairs. And actually the earlier question about the Boundary Waters Treaty may in fact be invoked to get attention in the United States. And our State Department, the federal government, would definitely be involved in that. but they could challenge a decision or um, a use of the water such that it was having an adverse effect on Canada. They would have every right, legal right, to do that. And they may have to go not just into, with using our treaty with the United States and Canada. They may want to go into the international court, but I think that they would be able to go through our State Department and the 1909 treaty, and they would, I'm sure they would invoke that to try and get control of that issue.
Okay, what results and repercussions could lower, let me see if I'm reading this correctly. Yeah, what results and repercussions could lower water levels in the Great Lakes potentially have on people?
Well, there's a number of things that could happen. We're seeing the lake levels now dropping, and that's affecting all of the riparian shoreline owners. There are extensive reaches now along Lake Michigan that I walk that were covered by water just a few years ago. So if the lake levels continue to drop, there's an impact on people that just live on the shoreline. But it also would impact all of our municipal water supplies that get their water from the various lakes, the intake pipes. It could affect, as you start to affect the estuaries, the areas along the shoreline, the wetland areas. You start to affect important parts of the ecosystem, the fisheries, affect our drinking water. The quality of our drinking water may be affected depending on where you're getting your water from the lake. I know, for example, here in the Milwaukee area, we've had to extend our pipes where we're drawing the water from Lake Michigan. We've had to extend them further out into Lake Michigan. And so it's not just a phenomenon, it isn't a phenomena of why they were doing that because of the lake levels, but I'm sure if the lakes were to continue to drop and drop precipitously, it could affect communities that are where their intake pipes are not so far out. Our problem was pollution and why we were extending the pipes further out so that we weren't going to be affected or affected less by the quality of the water that we were drawing in from Lake Michigan near the shoreline. But in some parts of the Great Lakes, if it continues to drop, it's going to have big impacts on the people not only who live along the shoreline, but even those who get their water from the Great Lakes.
You mentioned climate change is causing continued sea level rise and dropping levels in the Great Lakes. Is there concern about seawater intrusion into fresh drinking water resources along the coast?
There is. It's and that is a huge problem, but that's not the situation that we're facing here in the Great Lakes. We're fairly removed from that phenomena, but any of the communities along our oceans many of our communities along the oceans are having that problem with increasing saltwater intrusion, and a number of communities are investing huge amounts of money to deal with that problem. And if we continue to see that happening, they're going to have to invest more and more money in that situation.
Okay. What type of policies are being designed to counter the invasion of Asian carp?
Well, there's attempts have been made to better regulate, inspect and regulate and restrict invasive species coming through ballast water in the ships that are coming in off the oceans. As I said earlier in the presentation, that is the major cause of the invasive species that we're seeing. Now, the Asian carp present a different set of problems. The anticipation is, because the Asian carp are migrating up from the south in our parts of the region. And there's a great fear because the Asian carp have made it into the Illinois waterways that they may be coming up through, ironically, the diversion from Chicago, and they may use that as the pathway to get into Lake Michigan. There are other opportunities for them to get into the Great Lakes through some other waterways, but that's one of the paramount concerns. And they're trying to set up a set of restrictions, electric monitoring, and that would stop the Asian carp from migrating up into the canals that eventually could get into Chicago and then Lake Michigan. And a number of us, I think, believe that they have not been that successful. There's some fear that the Asian carp have already breached that particular entry point and have gotten into Lake Michigan. None have been found that I'm aware of in Lake Michigan. There's one instance, I think, of one being found over in Lake Erie. But it really represents a significant problem. And if that particular species were to get into the Great Lakes and be able to survive, it would really cause havoc on the ecosystem. We've seen what's happened with the sea lamprey years ago, the zebra mussels, the quagga mussels, and a lot of these other species. But the Asian carp would also be a huge, huge problem for the ecosystem if they get into the Great Lakes.
Okay, we have another question about the compact. In order to solidify and fully enhance the uniformity of the Great Lakes Compact between provinces and states, is it possible to establish an international treaty that fully acknowledges, supports, and upholds the compact in its entirety? So basically, a treaty designed to protect the compact.
It is. That's definitely a possibility. In fact, when folks were negotiating the compact, that was clearly an alternative should we go that route. But the risk and the concern was that, in effect, the states and the provinces may be giving up some of their authority in order to achieve that international treaty. And it was decided that it was not only another complex step to go through, but the risks may be too high to try and gain that added protection through an international treaty, that we may be asking for too much or expecting too much out of that process, and we may wind up losing control, maybe in more ways than we would like, to our respective federal governments. And so the thought was, let's try and see if we can do this, the arrangement that we have with the compact and then the international agreement with the Canadian provinces, and see if we can do it that way. And before we try and take on the added task of getting a new treaty or modifying the international treaty that we have with them from 1909.
Can an individual state opt out of the compact? Are there, what type of commitment is there, or are there penalties?
They could. A state could elect to remove itself, but it would create an unraveling of the compact. And I think there would be some pretty heavy-duty pressure put on a state that wanted to do that and therefore threaten the overall Great Lakes by not having this governing structure in place that took years to negotiate. But it's possible. I think there would be all kinds of challenges to that, not just political pressure, but yeah, a state could elect for a reason to get out of the compact. But I'm sure they would they'd be hearing from a lot of different people if they tried to do that. By the way, before there was one other point I should have made about the Asian carp and the Chicago waterways and the canal. There is some discussion, significant discussion, about trying to separate the basins again so that there isn't the diversion that's occurring, or in the short term, at least put a land barrier between the two basins south of Chicago so that the Asian carp or other species could not come up through the waterway in case of flooding, which is one of the big concerns. But that hasn't, we haven't gotten enough support for doing something like that. It'll be very expensive, but some folks are trying to point out that the ultimate harm to the Great Lakes would be far more expensive after the fact. So it may be prudent to invest that money now and separate the two basins once again.
We actually did have another question about the carp. Someone was asking if there was any research being done to look at ways to remove the carp rather than just looking at ways to stop their spread.
Well, there have been attempts at doing that. I don't know of any that are even remotely been successful. And I haven't heard of any that would involve, a different species preying on them, wiping them out, or whether or not you would use some kind of chemical or something to try and eradicate them or eliminate them. Anytime you start doing that, then you raise questions about what are the impacts on other species and the waterways where you would be employing that. But I'm not aware of any techniques yet that have been developed that would stop the carp or eliminate them.
Another question came in asking, did any of the research from the School of Freshwater Sciences help inform decisions regarding the compact or other policy?
Yes, there have been individuals from the School of Freshwater Sciences that have been involved and were providing information, continue to provide information on what are some of the threats, what are some of the risks, and why we need to manage more effectively the Great Lakes. So there are people here at the school, in other schools within the university, both here at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and in neighboring universities and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but also around the region. But yes, there have been scientists that have been active in supporting the compact and why it was needed, and they've been very helpful in explaining what's going on in the Great Lakes and that we need to get a better handle on managing them and managing them more effectively than we have been in the past. And I think it's an example of where good science, good sound science, can drive good policy, and we need to continually make those connections wherever we can. It really helps a lot when you have very strong, very professional scientists weighing in on an issue like this or issues like this to make a more compelling case for why we should do this, because it's not easy. It's a difficult road to get something like the compact drafted up, developed, and then adopted and passed in all of the states and by Congress. So they certainly were helpful in that regard.
Okay, I've read through all the questions that our participants provided, so if anyone has any more, or if you think of any, continue to type them in. I'm going to ask you one question. You were nice enough to provide us with a few more resources for teams who are interested in, and anyone interested in learning about the Great Lakes, and we posted them on Peter's page under our Professional Development Webinar Series website. And one of them that you had supplied was a book called The Great Lakes Water Wars, I was just wondering how your presentation tonight relates to that book, if you could explain that a little bit.
Sure. The author, Peter Annan, has been active writer in the Great Lakes region for many years, and um, he compiled this book, the information that then resulted in the book, by doing a series of interviews and his own research. And some of that research took him to other lakes, large lakes around the world. And I would really encourage you, those of you who might be interested in getting his book, because what it does is it establishes a number of the issues that were confronting the Great Lakes region. He really documents very effectively the threats of the potential threats of diversions for a coal slurry pipeline or recharging the Ogallala Aquifer or some of the other issues that were being talked about over the decades. But he also points out in that book, by the way, that the RLC, that was is vast body of water in the Soviet Union, what used to be the Soviet Union, and how that's in large part dried up over the years through the misuse and through diversions and through irrigation, and that any body of water, even as big as some of the Great Lakes, can ultimately be lost. And I would again encourage you to get his book. But what his writing documented and does document a number of the conditions which actually gave rise to the Great Lakes Compact. And I think he does it in a way that is understandable, fairly easy to read, but he documents it in a number of different ways, important ways, and he talked to a whole host of people who are knowledgeable about the Great Lakes. So I would encourage you to get his book if you can. Get it from the library.
I guess I have one more question. In talking about these water wars, thinking sort of globally, where does the U.S. rank, do you think, in sort of the importance of this topic or the need to really, really discuss it urgently?
Well, I guess I take that sort of at two different levels. One is our country, the United States, is well aware of the fact that, as people often say, that while oil was the resource of the last century, water will be of this century. And I certainly think that's the case. What we're seeing just from a national security perspective is these flashpoints around the world that are only growing in severity and extent. And that we may, in fact, have to be drawn in to trying to resolve some of them, and it's around water. But closer to home, we have major parts of the United States that have not done a very good job in managing the water resources that they do have. And that, in fact, we have national policies for years, for decades, that have encouraged growth in parts of the United States where we should not have been encouraging growth, certainly large population centers. And what we're doing is we're just moving water around, a scarce resource, in some cases by huge distances, with huge investments and subsidies by the federal government, which are crazy. They made no sense actually when they were trying to do it, and they certainly don't make any sense now. And we ought to we really need to have a serious discussion at the national level, the United States of America, about what we're doing with water and water resources and how we're not managing it very effectively and what we need to do to manage it more effectively. And maybe we can be an example, I hope we can be, if we do it right, on how we manage the Great Lakes. But many of you are probably very familiar with what we've done with the Colorado River, and how it doesn't even reach what used to be its destination because of the way that we've diverted it, the way we've used it. And we're using water in the desert that actually makes very little sense, even though we benefit from some of the things that are grown there. But continuing to subsidize and encourage population growth in some of these areas where that to start with were deserts and had scarce water resources didn't make any sense then, and they clearly don't make sense now. And we really need to get a handle on that. And maybe some of the folks that will be involved in this contest, in this competition, the National Ocean Sciences Bowl, maybe will be the ones who help us solve some of these problems and give us better solutions that our governments can adopt so that we can protect the resources that we do have. For the most part, the United States has been blessed with incredible water resources. We just haven't used them very effectively. And except for the arid regions of our country, we've had really very, very abundant water resources. But as I said, we're even in the Great Lakes region, we have streams and rivers, bodies of water in many of the states in Wisconsin that are drying up in the summer, which has been unheard of. But I think we're going to see more of that unless we do a better job at managing what we've got and using it more effectively.
On that topic, I think if any educators or students are interested, there was, at least I saw an interesting documentary called The Last Call at the Oasis, which discusses a lot of these topics of water supplies, both in the U.S. and other countries. So that's something to look online. It's kind of an interesting documentary. You can view the trailer online. You had mentioned the NOSB students, and we did have a question that was asking, what can students do to help protect their freshwater supplies where they live?
Oh, that's a great question. If they learn more about the water and the water resources in their area, where do they actually get their drinking water from? How much water do they use? Who's using what? Getting a better sense of how the water that they do have available and that they're using in their community would be a starting point. And then begin to look at how that water is used, whether it's being wasted. Are there ways to conserve it, protect it? Those would all be really wonderful exercises for students to get involved in and to learn more about their own natural environment that way. Water is critical for us to live, not just the human species, but these other living species. And so what we do with it is so important. And I think the starting point is just learning more about their own water resources in their community. A lot of times people don't understand. They go to the tap, they turn on their tap and they get a drink of water, or they just don't think about it. And they don't think about where it comes from, whether it's from under the groundwater, or whether it's from the surface body of water and what we're doing with it. So the more that students would get actively involved in their community and understanding that, it would be great. And it's frankly, the more that they get engaged and involved that way, if they're that interested and they want to continue it, there's a great need in science to have more young people get involved to understand the water resources and water resources cycle, the hydrological cycle, the cycle of life, really. The more that we can get young people involved, the better. We need more young people engaged.
Okay, it looks like we just have one last question for the evening. They're asking that in the news recently, there's been some talk of building oil shipping docks on, I think it was Lake Superior. Does the compact have any impact on the plans for something like that?
Yeah. Well, if the water will be used in any way, then arguably it might be. But I think the major concern is if you're going to if we're going to construct docks and then begin shipping oil over the Great Lakes, there are major risks in doing that. And if we were ever to have an accident, and we've had accidents in the past, and they really have a incredible impact on the lake, a particular lake. It doesn't matter which one, but in case of Lake Superior, it would be particularly horrific because that's the most pristine, it's the largest, and it's the most unpolluted, if you will. And to begin shipping major oil supplies over Lake Superior, I think we need to think hard about that and the risks that are involved in that. We've lost a lot of ships, even some recently, on the Great Lakes. Storms come up all of the time. It is a major risk, and if we had a major catastrophe with a ship going down with all of its cargo being oil, it would have an immense, enormous impact on that lake, and then the lakes probably even below, but certainly on all of the life within, or a good portion of the life and species in Lake Superior. So I know there's been that proposal. I hope that our elected leaders and our communities get actively involved in really discussing what the impacts of that might be.
Okay, so I think that was our last question for the evening. So first, I'd like to thank all of you who participated this evening in our webinar, especially those who typed in some questions. Thank you. And I'd really like to thank Peter. I know this is an interesting topic, something that both the educators and the students, like you said, may not necessarily think of where their freshwater supply comes from. And it's interesting to get a sort of policy aspect to the Great Lakes rather than just the biology and so the geology that we got in the past webinars. So thank you very much for presenting this evening.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it. And picking up on an earlier point you made, if people do have additional questions and I can help in responding, I certainly would.
Okay, and as I said earlier, there is a place, if you go to the NOSB.org website, we have a professional development webinar series page, and each individual presenter has their own page. If you click on Peter's page, you can certainly type in a comment or a question, and we will try to get an answer from him. I also mentioned earlier that he provided us with a few different resources that he thought would be of interest to either just educators or the NOSB teams if they want to learn more about the Great Lakes. It's not necessarily all policy related, but just the Great Lakes in general. Just also a reminder that we will be posting the recording of this webinar on his page tomorrow. So please feel free to share it with your students or others who you think would benefit from watching it. And lastly, Thursday night is our final presentation in the 2013 webinar series. And as I said earlier, we're going to have Dr. Carmen Aguilar and Dr. Russell Kuhl, who presented last week. They're going to be presenting sort of the second part of their food web and invasive species presentation. And you will want to go to our webinar series page. They have a paper that they're going to be presenting. So they would like everyone who's going to participate in that webinar to read the paper ahead of time. They said not to worry, it's not too technical or scientific, it's a review type of paper, but they're going to be discussing, it's a paper that they wrote, and they're going to be discussing it as part of their webinar, and that one they particularly want lots of questions from those who have read the paper. So thanks again, everyone, for participating this evening, and thank you again, Peter. We hope that you'll participate Thursday evening as well.
All right, thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Okay, I put all the participants on hold again.